Weapon 1. The M1 Garand. While most nations entered World War II arming their infantry with bolt-action rifles essentially unchanged since the previous World War, the United States alone issued its troops a genuine semi-automatic rifle as standard equipment, largely thanks to one dedicated Springfield Armory engineer who spent over a decade perfecting the design through countless prototype iterations. Canadian-born John Garand developed a long-stroke, gas piston-operated rifle chambered in the standard .30-06 cartridge, officially adopted by the Army in 1936 after the first production rifle was proofed and function-tested in July 1937. Loaded from an 8-round en-bloc clip that a soldier simply pressed straight down into the receiver, the M1 Garand ejected that empty clip automatically once the last round fired, producing a distinctive metallic ping that soldiers quickly learned to both love and occasionally fear, since a sharp-eared enemy could sometimes use that exact sound to judge when a rifle had run empty and needed a fresh clip loaded before it could fire again. Springfield Armory alone produced over 3.5 million M1 rifles between 1932 and 1945, with Winchester contributing another 513,880 units during the war years, and production peaked in January 1944 at over 122,000 rifles built in just 31 days, a pace of roughly 3,936 completed rifles rolling off the line every single day at the war's manufacturing height. Garand's design also gave American doctrine a genuine tactical advantage that rippled well beyond raw rate of fire, since a rifleman who no longer needed to manually cycle a bolt between shots could keep his eyes and his sight picture locked on the target throughout an entire engagement, an advantage combat reports from the period consistently credited with improving both accuracy and morale among frontline infantry. General George Patton's own assessment of the rifle, written in a January 1945 letter to the Army's Chief of Ordnance, has outlived nearly every other quote from the entire war. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. Garand himself never grew wealthy from a design that armed millions of American soldiers, remaining a salaried civilian government employee at Springfield Armory his entire career and receiving only a medal for merit rather than any significant financial windfall, even after a congressional bill proposing a $100,000 award for his contribution ultimately failed to pass through both chambers of Congress. Weapon 2. The Thompson Submachine Gun. Patented in 1920 by retired Army officer John T. Thompson as a portable trench broom, specifically meant to end the brutal trench warfare stalemates of the previous World War, the Thompson arrived several years too late for that conflict and instead spent the 1920s and early 1930s building a very different reputation entirely as the defining weapon of Prohibition-era organized crime across America. Once World War II broke out, the U.S. military formally adopted the design anyway, eventually producing over 1.5 million units chambered in .45 ACP with a cyclic rate reaching 725 rounds per minute. A genuinely controllable rate of fire compared to some of its overseas competitors, given that heavy .45 caliber bullets' relatively modest recoil impulse pushing back against the shooter's hands. The Thompson's internal Blishlock delayed blowback system, borrowed from naval gun design and later proven mostly unnecessary for a pistol-caliber weapon, added real cost and complexity to a design the military eventually simplified into the cheaper, more easily mass-produced M1 and M1A1 variants as the war ground on, and production speed mattered more than mechanical elegance, dropping the finned barrel, the delicate cuts compensator, and the drum magazine well entirely in favor of a simpler fixed firing pin and straight blowback operation that any competent machine shop could reliably manufacture at wartime scale. Despite that wartime simplification, the Thompson's distinctive silhouette, especially the earlier drum magazine-equipped versions, had already cemented itself so firmly in American popular culture through gangster films that soldiers carrying the genuinely simplified box magazine-only wartime version were still instantly recognized by a nickname the weapon had earned over a decade earlier on entirely different streets. Roughly 20% of the total 1.5 million Thompsons built During the war went to Allied nations under Lend-Lease arrangements, arming British commandos, Soviet paratroopers, and resistance fighters across occupied Europe who valued the weapon's stopping power in close quarters, fighting despite its considerable weight compared to the lighter submachine guns fielded by Germany and the Soviet Union throughout the same conflict. Weapon 3. The MP40. German engineer Heinrich Vollmer designed the MP40 as a simplified, cheaper-to-manufacture successor to the earlier MP38. Built almost entirely from stamped sheet steel and bakelite plastic components, specifically to slash the machining time and skilled labor a more traditionally milled submachine gun would otherwise demand from an already overstretched wartime economy. Chambered in 9mm with a 32-round magazine and firing from an open bolt, roughly 1.1 million MP40s were manufactured across Steyr, Erma Werke, and Haenel factories between 1940 and 1945. Arming German infantry, paratroopers, and armored vehicle crews who valued its compact folding stock for use inside cramped vehicle interiors, where a traditional fixed wood stock rifle would have proven genuinely awkward to maneuver. Here's the detail that trips up even serious history buffs. Allied troops almost universally called the weapon a Schmeisser, a nickname that stuck so thoroughly it still appears in films and video games today, despite the fact that designer Hugo Schmeisser had absolutely nothing to do with the MP40's actual design. His name apparently attached simply because it had already become associated with an entirely different earlier generation of German submachine guns. That mix-up turned into one of the most persistent cases of mistaken identity in the entire history of firearms nomenclature. A myth repeated in reference books and documentaries for decades before better research finally corrected the record. The MP40's folding stock design itself proved influential well beyond its own service life too. Since compact, folding, or collapsible stocks on a submachine gun were still a genuine novelty back in 1938, and post-war designers across multiple countries studied the MP40 specifically to understand how a stamped steel folding stock could be built strong enough to survive years of hard field use without failing at the hinge under repeated stress. If you've ever wondered how a weapon can earn a nickname the actual designer had nothing to do with, that's the kind of correction this channel keeps making. Subscribe if you want the next one straightened out the same way. Weapon 4. The Karabiner 98K. Germany's standard infantry rifle throughout the war traced its lineage directly back to Paul Mauser's original Gewehr 98 design from the turn of the century, shortened and refined into the Karabiner 98 Kurz, or Kar 98K, and formally adopted by the newly rebuilt Wehrmacht in 1935 as Hitler's government openly rearmed the country in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, signed after the previous World War. Chambered in 7.92 by 57mm Mauser and fed from a 5-round internal magazine loaded via stripper clip, the Kar 98K relied on the same fundamentally sound, controlled, round feedbolt action design that had already proven itself reliable across decades of prior Mauser rifles sold and licensed to armies worldwide, from South America to the Ottoman Empire and beyond, making it one of the most globally influential rifle actions of the entire 20th century, regardless of which specific army happened to be carrying it. That bolt action design demanded a soldier manually cycle the action between every single shot, a genuine disadvantage in raw rate of fire against semi-automatic rifles like the American M1 Garand. But German doctrine of the era leaned heavily on dedicated squad machine guns like the MG34 and later the MG42 to provide sustained firepower, treating the individual rifleman's job as precision fire support for that machine gun rather than high-volume suppression on his own. Millions of Kar 98K rifles were produced across multiple German arsenals throughout the war, and the design's basic Mauser action proved so fundamentally sound that it directly influenced countless post-war hunting and sporting rifles built by manufacturers who simply adapted the same reliable, controlled feed bolt system to civilian cartridges once the war finally ended. German snipers also relied heavily on a scoped variant of the exact same rifle, since the Kar 98K's inherent accuracy and simple, robust action made it a natural platform for precision marksmen who valued mechanical consistency over the higher rate of fire semi-automatic designs offered. a trade-off that kept dedicated bolt-action sniper variants in frontline service on every side of the conflict, despite the broader wartime shift toward faster-firing infantry weapons across most modern armies. Weapon 5. The MG42. German engineers built the MG42, specifically to fix everything expensive and slow about its predecessor, the finely machined MG34, replacing traditional milled parts entirely with die-formed sheet metal stampings welded together on an assembly line, a manufacturing shift that cut production time by roughly 35%, while barely denting the finished weapon's actual battlefield reliability. What genuinely set the MG42 apart mechanically was its roller locking system, a delayed blowback mechanism that let the gun cycle an almost unbelievable 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute, nearly double the rate of the American M1919 or the British Vickers gun it faced across the battlefield, with some late-war variants reportedly reaching as high as 1,800 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. That blistering rate of fire produced a sound distinctive enough to earn the weapon nicknames on every side of the conflict: Hitler's buzzsaw among American troops, Hitlersäge or bonesaw among the Germans themselves, and the linoleum ripper among Soviet soldiers who faced it directly on the brutal Eastern Front for years at a time. German gun crews trained to swap the MG42's barrel in under 7 seconds using nothing but heat-resistant mitts, a genuinely fast field maintenance procedure that let the weapon sustain that punishing rate of fire without the barrel warping or wearing out mid-battle, and crews typically carried multiple spare barrels specifically to keep that same rotation going through an extended firefight without ever losing the gun's rate of fire to overheating. That same roller locking mechanism didn't disappear once the war ended either, evolving directly into the post-war G3 rifle and the MP5 submachine gun, two of the most influential firearms of the entire Cold War era, meaning the exact mechanical principle behind Hitler's buzzsaw is still running inside police and military weapons built decades after the war that created it. German infantry doctrine reorganized itself almost entirely around the MG42 once it reached frontline units, structuring an entire 6-man squad around a single machine gun crew supported by riflemen rather than the other way around. A genuine inversion of the American and British approach that treated the individual rifleman as the primary weapon and the machine gun as supporting firepower rather than the central axis the whole squad organized itself around. Weapon 6. The PPSH-41. Soviet designer Georgy Shpagin answered a Red Army demand for a submachine gun that required virtually no lathe work at all, building the PPSH-41 almost entirely from heavy-gauge stampings and simple milled parts specifically so ordinary factories with minimal specialized tooling and inexperienced wartime labor could still mass-produce it reliably under the crushing pressure the Eastern Front demanded of Soviet industry. Adopted in December 1940 and chambered in 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev, the PPSH-41 became the single most produced submachine gun in history, with approximately 6 million units manufactured at the Tula Arms plant and dozens of other factories scattered across the Soviet Union. And by the end of the war, roughly 55% of all Soviet soldiers carried one into combat. Its signature 71-round drum magazine, borrowed almost directly from an earlier Finnish design encountered during the brutal 1939 Winter War against Finland, held nearly triple the ammunition of the German MP40's box magazine. Though Soviet troops learned through hard experience that loading more than about 65 rounds into that same drum risked spring-related misfeeds, leading many units to prefer the simpler, more dependable 35-round box magazine introduced later in the war instead for genuinely reliable sustained fire. Entire Soviet rifle divisions eventually went into battle equipped exclusively with the PPSH-41, using its devastating close-range volume of fire to dominate the brutal urban combat that defined battles like Stalingrad, where a submachine gun's short effective range mattered far less than its ability to fill a doorway or a stairwell with bullets faster than any bolt-action rifle ever could. The PPSH-41 also proved popular with German forces on the receiving end of it, since captured examples were reportedly common enough on the Eastern Front that some Wehrmacht units unofficially converted them to accept standard 9mm German submachine gun magazines, valuing the Soviet weapon's high rate of fire and rugged reliability enough to keep using it against its original owners whenever supply lines and captured stockpiles allowed. Weapon 7. The Lee-Enfield. Britain entered World War II, carrying essentially the same rifle family it had fielded in the previous World War. The short magazine Lee-Enfield, a bolt-action design whose 10-round detachable box magazine held twice the capacity of the 5-round magazines found on rival German and American service rifles of the same era. That extra capacity mattered less in practice than the rifle's genuinely faster cycling action, since a soldier still had to work the bolt manually between shots regardless of how many rounds sat waiting in the magazine below. But it did mean fewer reloading interruptions during a sustained firefight compared to Germany's Kar-98K or similar rifles carried by other nations. What truly separated the Lee-Enfield from other bolt actions of its generation was its rear-locking bolt design, cocking on the closing stroke rather than the opening one, letting a well-trained soldier cycle the action and fire again noticeably faster than the front-locking Mauser pattern actions used by German and many other forces of the same era. That speed advantage became legendary during the early battles of World War I, when British regulars trained to the standard Mad Minute could reportedly fire 15 to 20 aimed rounds in 60 seconds, a rate of fire so high that some German units initially mistook well-trained Lee-Enfield riflemen for entire machine gun positions dug into the same trench line. By the time World War II arrived, the design had been refined into the No. 4 Mark I pattern, simplified for faster wartime production while keeping that same fundamentally fast cycling action, and the rifle remained standard issue across British and Commonwealth forces from Britain and Canada to Australia, India, and beyond throughout the entire conflict. Total production across every Lee-Enfield variant eventually topped 17 million rifles built over the design's remarkably long service life, and the basic action remained in frontline use with some Commonwealth and former colonial forces for decades after 1945. A genuine testament to how well the original late Victorian-era design had solved the fundamental problem of getting aimed rifle fire downrange as quickly as a manually operated bolt-action mechanism could realistically manage under real combat pressure. Weapon 8. The Bren Gun. British ordnance officials needed a genuinely modern light machine gun by the mid-1930s and found their answer in Czechoslovakia's ZBVZ-26, licensing the design and building it domestically at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield, with the finished weapon's name simply combining the first two letters of Brno, where the original Czech design originated, and Enfield, where Britain would manufacture it going forward. Chambered in .303 British to match existing Lee-Enfield rifle ammunition and feeding from a distinctive curved 30-round box magazine mounted on top of the receiver, the Bren fired at a relatively controlled 500 rounds per minute, trading raw rate of fire for the kind of accuracy and reliability that made it genuinely popular with the two-man crews who operated it in the field. Production climbed steadily from that first 1937 rollout, starting around 400 guns a month in 1938 and eventually reaching roughly 1,000 completed Bren guns every single week by 1943, with the British Army continuously refining the design into lighter Mark III and Mark IV variants specifically built for soldiers fighting in the punishing jungle terrain of the Pacific and Southeast Asian theaters, a scale of output that would have seemed impossible to the small Czech design team who first sketched the weapon's basic layout barely a decade earlier, working with far more modest manufacturing resources. The Bren proved so fundamentally sound a design that it remained in frontline British service for decades after the war ended, eventually rechambered for the modern 7.62 NATO cartridge and seeing action as recently as the 1982 Falklands War. An operational lifespan spanning nearly half a century from a light machine gun, originally designed to answer a single narrow 1930s military requirement for a replacement infantry support weapon. British forces in the Pacific and Southeast Asian theaters particularly valued the Bren's top-mounted magazine and relatively compact size compared to belt-fed alternatives, since a soldier could carry and reload the weapon single-handedly while moving through dense jungle terrain where a heavier crew-served machine gun would